The 8th of November, 1519. The sun hangs low, reflecting off the obsidian-tipped spears of the guard. The air above the lake carries the scent of stagnant water, thick and heavy with the weight of what is to come. A golden litter moves slowly along the stone causeway, its rhythmic sway the only motion in a landscape frozen by anticipation. The massive structure stretches toward the horizon, wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast, yet it feels like a narrow path between two distinct realities. Thousands of eyes watch from the rooftops, but the only sound is the rhythmic thud of feet against stone. The litter begins its descent, grinding against the paved path. Every movement is calculated, every breath is measured. The guards hold their positions with rigid intensity, the dark glass of their spearheads catching the light like flickering flames. This is the threshold of an empire. The surface of the lake remains perfectly still, as if the water itself is holding its breath for the collision of two worlds. The litter stops. The escort halts. The space between the two forces narrows until there is nothing left but the silence of the waiting city. The litter came to a final, jarring halt. Inside, Moctezuma II sat perfectly still, his posture unyielding as stone. He did not look left or right, his focus locked on the path ahead. Opposite him, the line of the Imperial Guard parted. A figure emerged from the dust of the road. Hernan Cortés stepped forward, his presence defined by the rhythmic clatter of metal against metal. His plates were pitted with rust, showing the fatigue of a long, grueling journey. He stopped 10 paces out, his hand resting instinctively near his side. The contrast was immediate and absolute. On one side, the polished, dark glass of the native weaponry. On the other, the heavy, oxidized steel of a foreign power. Cortés did not bow. He stood with his feet planted wide, scanning the architecture of the city as if measuring its structural integrity for a siege. Moctezuma watched him, his expression unreadable, his body language offering no sign of welcome or fear. He was calculating the threat, weighing the man against the rumors of the relay runners. The two men stood separated by a narrow strip of sun-baked stone, while the city behind them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first word to be spoken. The air between them grew heavy, saturated with the pungent, stagnant odor of the lake. It was a thick, damp scent that clung to the stone causeway, marking the boundary of the city. Every inhalation felt laborious, as if the oxygen itself were being displaced by the sheer gravity of the moment. The silence was no longer empty, it was pressurized. Thousands of warriors stood on the rooftops, yet not a single foot shifted. No one spoke. The unspoken tension radiated from the center of the causeway, pulsing outward like ripples in the water. Cortés shifted his weight, the sound of his boots grinding against the sand and gravel echoing unnaturally loud. He was not merely standing before an emperor, he was surveying the structural weaknesses of a system that had held for centuries. Moctezuma remained fixed, his gaze steady, processing the arrival of these strangers as one might analyze a shifting geopolitical variable. The wind died down completely, leaving the smell of stagnant water to dominate the space. The historical weight of the encounter pressed down on the causeway, making the distance between the two men feel like an unbridgeable chasm. It was the threshold of a collapse, a singular instant where the momentum of two colliding worlds finally ground to a halt before the inevitable impact. The stillness broke. Moctezuma shifted his weight forward, his hands pressing against the frame of the litter. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate and practiced, honed by years of ritual performance. As he stepped onto the stone causeway, the sunlight hit him, turning the air around him into a kaleidoscope of reflected brilliance. The guards around the litter moved in perfect unison, creating a protective perimeter that separated their ruler from the foreign steel. He stood tall, his presence commanding the immediate focus of everyone on the causeway. He did not rush. He allowed the moment to expand, ensuring that every eye, both his own people and the men in rusted metal, was fixed upon him. He stood as the central point of the empire, the singular figure upon which the entire structure of the state balanced. He looked toward the city gates, then shifted his gaze to the man standing in the dust. The audacity of the invaders did not draw a flinch from him. He moved with a calculated grace, establishing his territory by the simple act of occupying the space. The ground beneath him felt solid, a testament to the centuries of power that radiated from his position. He was the host, and he had finally decided to acknowledge the presence of his unwelcome guests. Moctezuma did not look at the stranger with awe. He looked at him with the cold precision of a man who had already seen his enemy in miniature. For months, relay runners had sprinted across the empire, their lungs burning as they covered hundreds of miles to reach the capital. They arrived in waves, gasping and sweat-drenched, carrying pictorial reports that detailed every movement of the intruders. He had watched these scrolls spread across the palace floors, tracing the path of the steel-clad men from the coast to the interior. He knew the length of their blades, the number of their horses, and the specific cadence of their advance. Each runner had been questioned until the details of the strangers were etched into the emperor's mind. He saw the man before him now, not as a visitor from the heavens, but as a tactical problem defined by the ink and charcoal of his own intelligence network. He measured the space between them, calculating the risk against the data he had already compiled. The intelligence had been gathered at great cost, and now, the reality of the man in the dust aligned perfectly with the reports. He held the advantage of knowledge, and he intended to use it to dismantle the threat piece by piece. The intelligence reports had revealed a deeper fracture than the presence of strange weapons. Moctezuma traced the path of the visitors through the mountains, noting where the local tribes had bowed and where they had bled. His gaze locked onto the man standing across from him, realizing the true nature of the coalition. The Tlaxcalans, the empire's fiercest and most enduring rivals, had broken their own isolation to join the invaders. This was not merely a band of foreigners, it was a tactical pivot point. By flipping the Tlaxcalans, the strangers had secured a bridge across the most hostile terrain in the region. Moctezuma felt the weight of this alliance shift the balance of the entire valley. He saw the Tlaxcalan scouts lingering at the edge of the Spanish formation, their presence a silent proclamation of his empire's internal rot. The strangers had not arrived alone. They had arrived with the keys to the empire's own gate, handed to them by those who had sought to destroy it for generations. The geopolitical equation had changed in an instant. The threat was no longer just the steel in the hands of the invaders, but the betrayal that paved their road to his capital. He stood firm, absorbing the reality that his rivals had become the architects of his own vulnerability. Moctezuma pushed aside the whispers of prophecy and the rumors of gods returning from the sea. Those were stories for the commoners in the plazas, not for the ruler of the Triple Alliance. He looked at the man in the rusted steel and saw only a variable to be isolated. He mentally disassembled the threat. The horses were a finite resource. The gunpowder was a depleting asset, and the coalition of local rivals was a volatile, shifting weight. He was not facing a divine force, but a complex geopolitical equation that demanded a precise response. Every step the stranger took, every word he uttered, was filtered through a cold, analytical lens. If the man could be studied, he could be categorized. If he could be categorized, he could be neutralized. Moctezuma watched the rhythmic movement of the visitors, calculating how these disparate parts could be turned against one another. He felt no fear, only the sharp, focused intensity of a mathematician staring at an error in a long-standing proof. The palace was the laboratory where he would break this equation down to its base components. He stood motionless, his mind already mapping the inevitable collapse of the intruders' ambition once they were trapped within the city's intricate, inescapable design. Moctezuma broke his silence. He did not speak to the man directly, but gestured with a slow, sweeping motion toward the massive stone gates. The movement was fluid, practiced, and carried the weight of absolute authority. He wanted these outsiders inside the city walls. He wanted them off the open road and into the labyrinth of his own making. Cortez watched the gesture, his hand hovering near his belt, his eyes scanning the horizon for a hidden ambush. He did not understand the architecture of the trap, only that the door had been opened. Moctezuma stepped back, creating a clear path for the procession to move forward. The stone beneath their feet felt solid and unyielding, a reminder of the foundation he had built over decades. He waited for the first line of the strangers to cross the threshold. Each step they took into the city was a step away from their own logistics and into his domain of total control. He saw the confidence in their stride and viewed it as a flaw, a lack of awareness that they were walking into a cage designed for their neutralization. He turned, signaling his lords to yield the way, and led the march toward the heart of the capital. The causeway stretched ahead, a massive artery of stone and mortar slicing through the center of the lake. It was wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast, a feat of engineering that defied the expectations of the newcomers. The horses, unused to the unnatural precision of the masonry, stumbled, their hooves striking the stone with a rhythmic, hollow clatter that echoed across the water. On either side, the lake shimmered, a vast expanse of blue that hemmed them in. There was no room for maneuver, no space for a flanking charge. They were funneled into a single, narrow path that led directly into the city's depths. Moctezuma led the way, his pace unhurried, his posture rigid. Every few yards, the causeway widened into plazas, then narrowed again, a series of choke points designed to control the flow of thousands. The scale was overwhelming, a testament to a civilization that treated land as a medium to be shaped by will. Cortés glanced at the water, then at the towering walls rising in the distance, his grip tightening on his reins. They were no longer masters of their own momentum. The architecture itself was dictating their speed, their formation, and their vulnerability. They were passing through a gateway, and the sheer weight of the stone above and below them made the sky feel smaller with every passing second. The gates loomed, massive structures of carved stone that blocked the horizon. Moctezuma did not look back. He knew they were following. He had prepared the quarters in the ritual heart of the city, a place where the air was thick with incense and the walls were built to keep secrets, not just people. To him, the visitors were not a divine mystery. They were a puzzle of metal and unfamiliar tactics that required dissection. He walked with a steady, measured gait, guiding them through the narrow streets where the shadows of the temples stretched long and cold. Every turn was calculated to lead them deeper, away from their supply lines and into the center of his influence. He wanted them isolated. He wanted them observed. He watched the way they looked at the market stalls and the canal bridges, noting their confusion and their greed. He had already cleared the surrounding buildings of civilians to create a silent, sterile perimeter. Once they reached the inner palace, he would have them contained. He would study their weaknesses, divide their loyalties, and eventually dismantle their threat piece by piece. He felt no fear, only the cold satisfaction of a trap closing around its prey. The city was a cage, and the key was already in his hand. Cortés did not look at the temples as a pilgrim. His eyes flicked from the temple foundations to the narrow alleyways, calculating the distance between the stone walls and the width of a cavalry charge. He walked with a heavy, deliberate stride, keeping his right hand hovering inches from the hilt of his blade. The metal of the pommel was cool against his palm, a constant reminder of the only authority that mattered in this alien geography. He was not here to be welcomed or to observe. He was here to carve a path. Every time the procession turned, he noted the obstruction, the lack of space, and the sheer number of warriors observing from the rooftops. He felt the weight of the city pressing in, a physical pressure that would have broken a lesser man. Instead, it sharpened his resolve. He leaned toward his lieutenant, lowering his voice to a sharp, clipped tone. "Do not relax your grip. We are not guests here." He had no intention of being neutralized. He was already drafting a new reality, one where the palace gates would become his defensive perimeter. The coup was not a plan written on paper. It was a series of tactical improvisations he was already executing in his mind. He scanned the courtyard, looking for the one point of entry that would allow him to seize control before the sun went down. As they crossed the final threshold, the sky seemed to narrow, blocked by the towering stone structures on either side. The Spanish column moved into the heart of the city, but the sound of their own footsteps was quickly drowned out. Thousands of eyes watched from the rooftops, a silent, unblinking presence that followed every move. There was no chatter, no welcome, just the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a city that had stopped its daily labor to observe the intruders. The air grew dense with the scent of stagnant lake water rising from the canals. Cortés felt the shift in momentum. The wide causeway had narrowed into a corridor of stone that felt increasingly like a funnel. His men tightened their formation, their boots scraping against the uneven paving stones. Behind them, the massive iron-bound gates swung shut with a final, echoing thud that vibrated through the ground. The sound signaled a total break from the world they knew. They were no longer an expeditionary force. They were a small knot of metal and grit deep within an ocean of stone and hostile silence. There was no turning back now. The path ahead led only deeper into the labyrinth, and the isolation was absolute. Inside the palace, the atmosphere transformed into a theater of calculated grace. Servants moved in synchronized silence, placing platters of food and water before the visitors. Moctezuma gestured toward a low stone dais, his movements smooth, precise, and entirely devoid of urgency. He spoke in a low, measured tone, offering the palace as a sanctuary. It was a play for time, a way to anchor the intruders in a fixed location where they could be monitored. Cortez took a seat, his hands resting flat on his knees, his posture rigid. He accepted the water, but his eyes never left the emperor. He understood the gesture for what it was, a velvet-lined cage. Every polite nod from the Aztec lords felt like a tightening of a noose. Cortez forced a smile, nodding in appreciation, while his mind mapped the exits and the proximity of his guards. The tension in the room was a physical weight, vibrating between them. They sat in the center of a grand hall, two architects of ruin, each pretending that this was a meeting of allies. Outside, the city remained silent, waiting for the signal that would turn this forced politeness into a bloodbath. They were sizing each other up, measuring the distance between a false peace and the inevitable strike. The heavy stone doors clicked into their sockets, sealing the palace chamber. The sound was final, a sharp metallic snap that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. Moctezuma remained seated, his gaze fixed on the center of the room, while the lords surrounding him shifted their positions, moving to block the primary exits. Cortez felt the air change. The scent of incense was suddenly suffocating, masking the smell of damp earth and stale water. He stood up, his hand reflexively tightening on his sword hilt. The transition was instantaneous. Where there had been the pretense of a welcome, there was now the cold geometry of a prison. The guards at the threshold did not look away. They stood with their feet planted, their focus entirely on the Spanish party. Cortez realized the perimeter had been breached not by force, but by invitation. Every window was narrow, every exit was guarded, and the silence from the courtyard was no longer neutral. It was expectant. He looked back at the door, measuring the thickness of the timber and the weight of the iron bolts. There was no way to reverse the movement of the last hour. The trap was not just the city, it was the room itself. Destiny had narrowed to this single enclosed space where the only remaining question was who would strike first. Cortez moved toward the chamber window, his caution overriding the urge to pace. He pushed the heavy frame aside just enough to peer into the courtyard. Above, the city was alive with a terrifying stillness. Thousands of warriors occupied the rooftops of the surrounding structures. They were not shouting, they were not moving, they were simply watching. Each figure stood with the rigidity of a statue, their presence creating a perimeter that spanned the entire horizon. The Spanish men in the courtyard below stopped their tasks, their eyes drawn upward by the sheer weight of 1,000 gazes. Every movement the intruders made was tracked from above. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating shroud that made the sound of a leather strap tightening or a sword being shifted seem deafening. Cortez looked left, then right. The rooftops were occupied in every direction. It was a tactical trap that required no walls. The warriors held the high ground, their numbers turning the palace into an island within an ocean of hostile observers. The Spanish realized they were not just trapped by the doors behind them, but pinned by the eyes above them. The air grew thin as the reality of their isolation settled in. They were not guests. They were targets waiting for a signal that could come from any rooftop at any moment. Cortez turned his back on the windows. He did not care for the eyes on the rooftops anymore. He marched into the heart of the palace of Axayacatl, his boots striking the polished stone floor with rhythmic, unrelenting precision. His men followed, their hands hovering near their hilts, scanning the shadows of the long, narrow corridors for any sign of movement. They reached an inner gate, a massive barrier of carved wood and metal that blocked their path to the inner sanctum. It was locked. The silence in the hallway deepened, heavy with the scent of stagnant air and old stone. A soldier reached for the bolt, but Cortés pushed him aside. He did not wait for an invitation or a key. He gripped the iron handle, his knuckles white with the exertion, and braced his shoulder against the timber. He kicked the base of the gate, once, then twice. The wood groaned, the hinges shrieked under the pressure, and the barrier swung inward with a violent thud. He stepped over the threshold, his sword half drawn, the steel ringing softly against the scabbard. The pretense of a diplomatic visit had disintegrated. He was no longer a guest. He was a predator moving through the gut of the empire, and the final move was already in motion. Moctezuma watched from the shadows of the dais as the heavy gate splintered. He had calculated for a slow game of diplomatic attrition, a series of rituals to drain the strangers of their purpose. But the sound of the splintering wood shattered his logic. He stepped forward, his hand signaling for his lords to block the corridor. Yet the men hesitated. They looked at the iron blades, then at the emperor, their eyes wide with uncertainty. The trap he had laid the city itself as a gilded cage was failing. He had expected the strangers to succumb to the weight of his court, to be neutralized by the sheer gravity of his influence. Instead, they were tearing through the architecture of his palace as if it were parchment. A cold realization took hold. The variables had shifted. He was no longer the architect of this encounter. He was the primary target. He saw the Spanish leader move with an aim that bypassed all protocol. The empire relied on a fragile network of tribute held together by the constant threat of force. Now, that same force was directed inward. Moctezuma stood still, his heart hammering against his ribs as he saw the balance of power pivot toward the men with steel. The predator and the prey had swapped places in the span of a single heartbeat. Cortés closed the distance in 3 long strides, his boots echoing against the dais. He did not bow. He did not speak a word of protocol. He reached the base of the platform and stopped, his presence cutting through the room like a blade. Moctezuma raised a hand, attempting to command his captains to clear the hall, but the men did not move. They stared at the steel weapons, their hands locked at their sides, paralyzed by the sudden shift in momentum. The silence was absolute. Cortés stepped up onto the dais, closing the gap until he was within arm's reach of the emperor. He did not strike. He simply moved into the personal space where authority usually resided. He placed a firm grip on the emperor's shoulder, guiding him backward toward the stone wall. The message was clear. The guards watched as their ruler was pushed toward the inner chambers, their eyes darting between their masters and the intruders. With one final shove, Cortés forced the emperor into the small, windowless room behind the throne. He slammed the heavy door shut, the sound echoing through the palace like a gavel. The house arrest was absolute. The palace had become a prison, and the authority of the empire had been effectively severed in under 12 hours. Cortés did not occupy the throne. He stood in the courtyard, watching the messengers arrive with their tributes of gold and grain. The empire was held together by fear, a fragile chain of obligations that stretched across the valley. He understood that if he pulled one link, the entire structure would slacken. He summoned the local governors, one by one. He spoke to them not as a guest, but as the new center of gravity. He pointed to the locked room where the emperor remained, and he told them that the old order had ended. Their fear of the Aztecs was the weapon he used to break them. He demanded the records of the tribute, the lists of those who owed labor, and the maps of the secret grain stores. The governors hesitated, calculating their own survival against the weight of tradition. When they saw the steel blades of the Spanish, they chose to cooperate. They handed over the ledgers. They redirected the flow of resources away from the palace and toward the Spanish camp. By sundown, the administrative heart of the empire was beating for its captors. Cortés had turned the system of tribute into a system of surrender. The empire was dismantling itself from within, one ledger entry at a time, while the emperor watched from behind a bolted door. The heavy door creaked open. Moctezuma stepped back into the central hall, his movements stiff and deliberate. The assembled lords of the Triple Alliance stood in a semicircle, their hands hovering near their weapons, eyes locked on the Spanish soldiers lining the perimeter. The tension in the room was a physical weight, thick and suffocating. Moctezuma surveyed his commanders. He saw the fire in their eyes, the readiness to strike, the belief that they could still reclaim the palace through sheer numbers. He stood at the center of the dais, his back straight, and raised his hand. The room fell into an expectant, heavy silence. He spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the stone floor. He commanded them to lay down their arms and accept the new reality of the palace. The lords faltered. A murmur of confusion rippled through the ranks, but the authority of the throne remained the only law they knew. One by one, the captains lowered their gaze, their fingers slipping away from their hilts. They turned and walked toward the gates, leaving their leader isolated. The order of the empire had been turned against itself. With a single instruction, the emperor had validated his own captivity and signaled the beginning of the end. He watched as his lords departed, leaving the palace to the silence of the occupiers. The departure of the lords did not bring peace. It brought the dissolution of the order that had held the valley in check for a century. Across the city, the news of the submission spread like a contagion. The tributary states, long stifled by the central authority, saw the weakness at the core and seized their chance. In the marketplaces, the flow of goods stopped. In the council chambers of the surrounding cities, the envoys from Tenochtitlan were stripped of their status. The political architecture of the Triple Alliance began to tear itself apart. Factions that had been bound by shared fear now looked for opportunities to settle old scores. A commander from a northern district refused to send the seasonal harvest, citing the collapse of the central mandate. Another city declared its independence, burning the banners of the alliance in the main square. The Spanish watched from the palace walls as the streets below turned into a landscape of competing interests. The empire was no longer a single entity. It had fractured into a dozen warring remnants, each vying for advantage in the sudden void. The internal enemies of the state, once kept in check by the threat of force, now operated with total impunity. The machinery of governance was grinding to a halt, replaced by the chaotic scramble of local ambition. The sun touched the western horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the stone causeways of Tenochtitlan. The light had turned a deep, blood orange, reflecting off the surface of the lake in jagged ripples. This was the end of the first day of the occupation, a day that had dismantled a century of imperial stability. As the horizon swallowed the sun, the temperature dropped sharply, and the city fell into a heavy, unnatural quiet. The sounds of the market had died hours ago, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of metal on stone as the guards changed positions. The countdown had begun. Every minute that passed without a unified counterstrike solidified the Spanish hold on the palace. The political structures that once commanded the entire valley now existed only in name, paralyzed by the vacuum left at their center. The city seemed to hold its breath. This sunset was not merely the end of a day, it was the closing of an era. The machinery of the state was locked, the gears jammed by its own internal contradictions. There would be no rising sun that brought back the old order. The irreversible slide toward extinction had gained its final momentum, and the night that followed would be the first of many in a long, dark descent. The causeway that had served as the grand entrance for the visitors now became the conduit for disaster. Every decision made during that first encounter, every gesture of hospitality, and every calculated silence had been a step toward this point. The bridge was no longer a symbol of connection. It was a tactical funnel. The Spanish grip on the palace was absolute, and the local lords, paralyzed by their own internal rivalries, watched as the bridge became a trap. There was no room for negotiation anymore. The air on the causeway grew cold, thick with the scent of impending violence. The path to the future was being paved by the failure of the past. Each hour that ticked by was a movement toward inevitable confrontation. The blood of the future was already written into the geography of the city, etched into the stone of the very road where the two leaders first met. There would be no mercy, only the consequences of a shattered alliance. The countdown had turned into a march toward a night of reckoning. Every stone on the causeway held the weight of the coming slaughter, turning a bridge into a site of permanent, irreversible sorrow. Months of simmering resentment and fragile containment reached their breaking point on the night of June 30, 1520. The air in Tenochtitlan had been heavy for weeks, a pressure cooker of shifting loyalties and quiet whispers. Then, the silence shattered. A single horn blast echoed across the lake, followed by a roar that rose from every district of the city simultaneously. The coalition forces, long waiting for a sign, surged toward the palace. The Spanish, caught in the transition of a sudden retreat, found their escape routes blocked by the very geography they had once mapped for dominance. The struggle for control was not a slow decline, but an explosive collision of steel and desperation. Within moments, the organized occupation crumbled under the weight of thousands of warriors reclaiming their streets. The narrow channels between the buildings became choke points where every movement was met with resistance. There was no room to maneuver. The night, once a time for strategic planning, transformed into a frantic, violent scramble for survival. The coalition did not just attack, they dismantled the Spanish perimeter with systematic force. The city belonged to the chaos now, and the brief, fragile peace of the occupation was officially dead. The streets of Tenochtitlan became a singular, widening wound. What started as a coordinated uprising devolved into 12 hours of absolute, terrifying chaos. Every alleyway served as a trap. The stone pathways, once centers of commerce, were now slick with blood that drained into the stagnant canals. There was no front line anymore. The fight was everywhere at once. Warriors poured from every doorway, their movements synchronized by a singular, desperate intent to reclaim the city. The Spanish perimeter fractured under the sheer density of the assault. Men scrambled over the bodies of the fallen, seeking cover in the shadows of the very buildings they had once held. The air turned thick with the acrid stench of smoke and the persistent, rhythmic sound of metal striking stone. Panic replaced strategy. The systematic order of the occupation dissolved into a frantic scramble for the causeways. Those who tried to flee found the bridges already broken or choked with debris. Every corner turned brought a new surge of resistance. The city did not just fight back, it consumed the invaders. By the time the night reached its peak, the distinction between soldier and civilian, between conqueror and conquered, had been erased by the sheer scale of the slaughter. The weight of centuries began to collapse in the dark. Stone structures that had stood for generations crumbled under the force of the fighting. It was not just a battle for territory. It was the systematic erasure of a civilization's legacy. The grand plazas, once the heart of the empire, were now littered with the debris of broken lives and shattered traditions. One by one, the markers of order were torn down or set ablaze. The firelight flickered against the walls of the palace, casting long, jagged shadows that danced over the destruction. Everything that had been built over hundreds of years was being undone in a single, violent night. The organization of the city, the precision of its design, the very foundation of its existence, it all dissolved into the mud and the blood. The invaders watched as the structural integrity of the state vanished, realizing too late that they were destroying the very thing they sought to inherit. Smoke rose into the night, thick and choking, blotting out the stars. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, the city was unrecognizable. The work of ages had been reduced to ash and ruin, proving that a civilization, no matter how vast, remains fragile when the core is torn apart. The collapse was not merely a matter of imported steel or gunpowder. It was the result of a precise, internal rot. Within the palace walls, the truth finally surfaced. The empire was being dismantled by its own architects. Moctezuma watched from the inner chambers as his trusted lords received signals from the streets, not commands to defend, but orders to stand aside. The tributary system, held together for generations by the threat of force, had snapped. These internal enemies saw the chaos not as a tragedy, but as a tactical opening to settle old debts. One by one, the commanders of the palace guard sheathed their blades and walked away, leaving the gates wide open. The betrayal was cold and calculated. It moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, turning the empire's rigid hierarchy into a liability. The leadership realized the devastating reality. Their power had been a hollow shell. They had focused on the threat at the gates, while their own foundations were being hollowed out from beneath them. As the final loyalists were pushed back, the realization settled in the air, heavier than the smoke. The empire did not simply fail, it was dismantled from within, turned against itself by the very people who had once sworn to protect it. The silence that followed the fighting was absolute. It was the quiet of a room where the air has been sucked out. Where once the halls echoed with the movement of thousands, now only the settling of dust remained. This was the final, hard lesson left behind by the ruin. Power is not a permanent state, but a fragile equilibrium. It takes generations to build the architecture of an empire. Yet it takes only a single, calculated betrayal to reduce it to a memory. The suddenness of the end left no room for doubt. The structures that seemed immutable had proven to be as brittle as dry clay. Looking back at the empty causeways, the reality became clear. Influence, once lost to internal fracture, cannot be gathered up again. The empire had been a vast, complex organism, but it was now merely a collection of silent stones and forgotten names. There would be no divine intervention to restore what had been discarded. The lesson was cold, clinical, and irreversible. As the last embers flickered out, the landscape stood as a testament to the sudden, brutal speed with which a world can be unmade. The history books would record the fall, but they would never capture the hollow, crushing weight of the silence that remained in its wake. History does not merely record these events, it uses them as a jagged edge to cut through the illusions of the present. The memory of divine intervention, once whispered in the courts, has been stripped away by the cold reality of political failure. It was never the gods who decided the fate of the city, but the men who chose to prioritize their own grievances over the survival of their society. This internal division acts as a permanent fracture in the bedrock of civilization. Every alliance, no matter how vast or seemingly secure, carries the seeds of its own dissolution if the architecture of power is built on fear rather than unity. The warning resonates across centuries. When the loyalty of a people becomes a commodity to be traded by rivals, the collapse is not a possibility, it is a mathematical certainty. The stones of Tenochtitlan stand as a silent, monolithic witness to this truth. They remind us that the most dangerous enemies are not those who arrive with steel at the gates, but those who operate from within the palace walls. The echo of this betrayal serves as a final, stark reminder that the fragility of power is defined by the integrity of the collective, and once that bond is severed, no amount of force can ever stitch the world back together. The sun sets now on a different world, where the causeways once pulsed with the movement of a thriving empire. Only the wind stirs the stagnant lake water against broken stone. The city lies exposed, its ritual heart silenced, its great architecture surrendered to the encroaching weeds and the slow weight of time. This is the final image of that brutal collision, a landscape emptied of its people, stripped of its purpose, and left to crumble into the mud of history. The iron gates that once signaled a new era now hang loose on rusted hinges, serving no one. The collision of two worlds did not create a synthesis, it left behind a void. Every stone here speaks of the irreversible cost of a political architecture that turned against itself. There is no recovery, no return, and no echo of the life that once defined these streets. Just the quiet, relentless advance of the horizon. The countdown has reached zero. The empire is gone, the actors have vanished, and the dust has finally settled over the ruins of a civilization that believed it would last forever. Nothing remains but the desolate, haunting stillness of a story that has reached its absolute, final end.